All right, let's move to session number 2, which is going to be dealing with the market, legal and policy perspectives of the 3 countries that they have entered and they have successfully got out from the crisis. And for this session, we are having a chair who is one of the world experts in sovereign debt restructuring. He is a managing partner of NewState Partners. And also we have a distinguished panel who is going to be trying to be dealing with these 3 issues: the legal issues, the policy issues, the market issues, and also the credit rating agencies. I'm going to be leaving it to Rafael in order to be introducing his panel. Thank you, Rafael.
Thank you, Michael. He is the leading expert in sovereign debt restructurings. I think he's written more papers than anybody else around the world. But thank you for those kind remarks. I'm going to read a little bit this time because I've been working around different time zones for the last few days. So I don't even know where I am and what time it is around the world these days. So a very good day to everyone. Thank you for being here. It is really an honor to be here, and I'm delighted to be part of this panel in which we'll try to look at the market, the legal, and the credit rating perspectives for the cases of Cyprus, Ireland, and Portugal. While each country's situation is very unique in a number of ways, there are a number of common threads that we can look at, and why policy responses came out the way they came out, because we would have known that if they were let to linger, they could have had even a much more devastating sort of impact, not only in the European Union, but around markets around the world. One thing that I'll say is kind of interesting is that the way that we look at it from our perspective is that these 3 countries did not restructure their debts. I know that Michael and many people look at Cyprus as a restructuring, but we do not, because we looked at it from the perspective of a liability management operation. It was preemptive. So just semantics, but when you hear a lot of market commentary is there was no restructuring of the Cyprus debt. Let me just quickly thank George Sekos and Michael again for their kind invitation and for what they've done to organize this panel. I think it's important to do that, and we appreciate all your efforts to organize it. It's not easy to do, and it's difficult to coordinate schedules, particularly when it's a city like Philadelphia, with all due respect. It's easier to go to Washington or New York than it is to Philadelphia. I would also like to introduce my panel. They're very distinguished speakers. First, I would like to introduce Stephen Kargman, who is really a recognized and respected legal authority, extensive experience in sovereign in corporate restructurings as well as international insolvencies. He was formerly the lead attorney for the U.S. Exim Bank, and he also served as the general counsel for the New York State Financial Control Board. He is currently now the president and also the founder of Kargman Associates. Steve will focus his remarks on the legal lessons from the European crisis, focusing on these 3 country cases. Then also Elena Duggar, who is the chair of Moody's Macroeconomic Board, who is responsible for developing the macroeconomic forecast that underpins the credit rating processes. She manages the research team in the credit strategy and the research group, which authors the global macroeconomic outlooks. She will discuss the outlook for the Eurozone, the country cases, and how fundamentals have evolved as a consequence of the European crisis. She will also provide a very unique overview on how the credit rating process has actually changed. The methodology has evolved as a consequence of some of these consequences and some of the lessons that we can take from markets. And then finally, I'd like to introduce John Pinner, who is the managing director and head of research at Greylock Capital Management, which is a fund that specializes in special situations. And in my line of work, I see them all the time, working sometimes with them and sometimes against them. But from the investor perspective, I think he brings a very unique perspective because he'll discuss his experience trading these credits, particularly in the case of Iceland and Greece, which is, I think, mostly what you've been involved in, though I think you have other expert questions that will come out of that. I think that would be very interesting to hear that. Before I turn and I think what we'll do is I'll ask them, the way we prepared it is that we'll ask Steve to go first, then ask John, and then I'll ask Elena to do the presentation to wrap it up, given the fact that she'll be discussing the perspectives. I know that Christian and a couple of others have already spoken about the causes of European Union, the crisis, and so forth, but I would like to make a couple of remarks just to anchor the presentations that they will be coming out. Very simplistic form, and then I'll make a couple of observations in terms of what I think are some of the main lessons that I personally have taken out from these countries and the European zone in general. I really think that the conference is quite aptly timed. We are now basically approaching the 10th anniversary of the European crisis, 2008 really, 2009, and the 20th anniversary of the introduction of the euro currency. I remember in 1988 when I took my first class in college about the European Union, and my professor was a British professor, and he was very much against the European Union. He said, well, it would fail. 20 years on, it hasn't really failed to say, although there's a lot of problems, so we'll see. But there are a lot of questions that we can take from that, and I think that the two main ones that I always look at is how have we changed the way in which we assess and manage sovereign risk. I think we've come a long way in the last 10 years. And then second, what have we learned and what can we continue to learn in terms of respecting how we prevent and how we have to manage sovereign crises. I think the first thing I'd like to say is, I think it's interesting, is that I always thought of the European Union, the European project, more as a political undertaking, more than an economic endeavor. For me, I think it's a noble effort. And I think it has been successful in some ways, and of course there's a lot of gaps and there's also some flaws, but nonetheless it's been something that has had a great purpose. And I think for some reason you can say that there's been peace in the European Union when there has been such diversity for a long time. And I think what I always take from it is that the integrated political and regulatory environment that has come out of the European Union has not been really planned, in my opinion. It's been sort of, if I can say this, is the result of responses to unforeseen shocks and crises, rather than carefully being thought out to prepare the institutions for the rising challenges that have arisen throughout the years. Of course, I'm not an expert, so I'm sure that many of you, like Aitor and Christian, will have a better view on that, but that's a personal observation more than a market observation. There are really a number of factors that led to the sort of the financial crisis of 2008. I'm going to simplify it, so what I'm trying to do here is not trying to make it, to just cross it over, but the way I looked at it is that basically is that without a doubt, the European Union was ill-equipped and unharmonized financial regulatory system couldn't deal with the situation of the crisis. I think that Maastricht and other treaties that have been created simply did not consider or really address the issue of the symbolic and symbiotic linkages and relationship that really exists between the government, the sovereigns, and the financial system of particularly not only the country but the European Union. The global financial crisis, particularly in the European Union, really crystallized, in my opinion, the need for a wider and much stronger regulatory regimes. I really am a big sort of a supporter and admirer of Paul Volcker. I think he's been a very strong advocate of the importance of these regulatory regimes, and I think that the European Union really shows that. Across the globe, bank credit expanded disproportionately compared to economic growth, as some of the presenters from the first session really were able to show, and that basically led to the linkages of seeing vast risk-taking activities and increased leverage positions. And I think that we know that Ireland, Cyprus, and Portugal were severely affected in different ways. I think European governments in general have had to really do what they had to do in order to be able to deal with those inherent weaknesses of the financial systems. And then banks became too complex, very interconnected across all sectors, and the risk of failure would have created economic chaos, not only in these countries, but the zone and probably even around the world, as we saw the way that the United States also responded to the crisis here in this country. And I think that what's interesting is, this leads me to some of the observations that I wanted to make. My first observation really is on the topic of sovereign crisis, and I think Christian said that already, and I wanted to just reemphasize it. This is not going to be the last, and it's not going to be the crisis that the world, or indeed the European Union, will see. Crises that have come, they also have gone. They've been going around for millennia, if I can say that. We can go back and look at history of sovereign debt crises, and you can go back into Greece, when the different temples back even before crisis, they're the first ones who actually defaulted on the loans that they were actually borrowing from their constituencies. They really are part of normal economic cycles, which all of us are studying here. I think what is interesting is that as our world and our economies become ever more interdependent and interconnected, the intensity and the ramifications of those crises appear to become even more far-reaching than ever. And I think governments need to respond appropriately, and they need to take the steps to collaborate to address risk challenges in a more pragmatic and effective manner, notwithstanding what's happening in the European Union with the decision by our friends in the European of Britain to decide to leave the European Union, or Brexit notwithstanding. I will not say anything else about Brexit because I do live there, and as many committees will come saying, like, they made their decision. They're jumping out of the airplane without a parachute, but they still want to do it. So sovereign debt crises, like I said before, they come and gone. I think they will happen again, and in each crisis what I think needs to happen is that we need to start to learn to deal with the root causes of a crisis and not the symptoms, and it always looks like countries or governments always try to deal with those symptoms rather than the actual roots. That creates more of a problem. Treating the symptoms rather than the root causes of the imbalances is really what governments try to do is wishful thinking, hoping that things will go away if they wait a little bit longer. Like the anecdote or the metaphor of the office of the I forgot the name of the English, the big bird that puts his head, the ostrich who puts his head in the sand, hoping that the predator will just not see his face, but of course the body's still out there. My second observation really deals with the nature of debt and liabilities. And I say it because I think it's important to understand that debt is not evil. I know Warren Buffett calls derivatives weapons of mass destruction, financial instruments of mass destruction, but at the end of the day, debt is not evil. It's nothing less and nothing more than a tool that can be used for effective financial planning. But it is very dependent on market conditions. And as such, market forces and developments will have an impact on debt conditions. And for this reason, I think governments, corporations, and us as individuals, we have to monitor our debts, our liabilities, and really try to practically respond to evolving circumstances and changes. Because problems will arise when imbalances, be them from unforeseen external shocks or other factors, are ignored and misdiagnosed, and the situation is allowed to get itself of itself. Again, I will say prudent and effective regulation is necessary. My third observation is about treating the symptoms of a crisis rather than the root problem. That is really what I've been trying to say. The story of the Eurozone crisis in the simplest form is a rapid buildup of macroeconomic imbalances and a regulatory system that basically lacks the tools to address those risks and that emerge in financial systems. Now with the ESM, I'm glad we have Aitor here, we'll see exactly if that can get there. And then my final observation is the importance of assessing and managing risk, which is really what we're here for. Before the euro was introduced, market participants were always discussing, particularly traders, discussing the issue of convergence rates. You remember that back in 1999. That was a very interesting consideration. I'm going to put a little slide there. I thought that the slide that I think Michael put forward was very interesting, or I think, but there it is. This is interesting. In 1998, what I thought was interesting is that before the, a lot of traders made a lot of money with convergence rates, but that's not the case anymore. It's just interesting. Many people believe that the credit profile of Portugal, Ireland, and Cyprus at one point or another was expected to converge to Germany and to the stronger economies in the core. And at the end of the day, they'll provide more investment opportunities. I used to manage the foreign exchange reserves of the monetary authorities of the United States. I was in charge of the yen, but you remember the US authorities had only two major currencies in the foreign exchange reserve. That's still the case, which is at that time was the Deutschmark and the Japanese yen. We were used to, in 1990, we sat down and had endless meetings about how we were going to find, we're going to start managing and investing the euro. And the big question at the time is like, have we found new investment opportunities with the euro? In other words, can we extend our credit investment away from Germany? Can we go into Italy? Can we go into some of the other countries in the European Union? And the decision by the Federal Reserve at that time and the US Treasury was, no, we're not. We're going to stick with Germany because all we care about is liquidity and second, capital preservation. And we wanted to make sure that credit fundamentals had to be into our investment analysis. And I think that you see today, Germany continues. This is the last sort of spreads. There is differentiation. Market participants now are much more looking into so fundamentals and countries, whether or not it's the same currency or not. They're still going to have to deal with that situation. Okay, I'm going to stop here now. I'm now going to pass it on to Steve, and we'll take it. I'm going to ask you to hold your questions until the end. I had prepared some questions, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip those questions and open up to the audience when we finish. Thank you, Steve.
Good morning. I want to thank George and Michael for inviting me, and Rafael for chairing our panel, and it's a privilege, of course, to be with Elena and Jonathan. This morning I've been asked to discuss legal issues relating to the three case studies that have been under consideration so far. And I'm going to focus on the issue of legal predictability and certainty for creditors and investors at a time of financial exigency. And so we're going to go through several examples of what I'm talking about. Oh, I did it? Okay. Okay.
You can't see it in that.
Yeah, you can't see it on here. Okay. Okay. So, as is pointed out in this slide, sovereign debt crises, as we've heard already, and Rafael was mentioning it, they require national governments to take special, even extraordinary measures to deal with a crisis, whether it's recapitalizing banks. They have to sometimes take special measures to get consent for a restructuring plan and do things that wouldn't ordinarily be done in a debt transaction. And sometimes governments, we've heard reference to this, when there's a buildup in non-performing loans in a national banking system, they will create a special instrumentality, an asset management company, to take over the non-performing loans. But those types of measures can raise significant issues with legal and policy implications. one issue which is very important to lawyers, but also to creditors and investors, is do such measures conflict with legitimate third-party expectations of legal certainty and legal predictability? One example we'll explore later in the presentation is, we all know there's supposed to be an established hierarchy of ranking of priorities for creditors, and if that's upset by one of these extraordinary measures, what's the effect of that? Then a second issue is, do these emergency measures by sovereigns, do they improperly impinge on property rights or other special interests, for example, due process rights of third parties? And then when do such measures go too far, even in the context of a sovereign facing exigent circumstances? We'll get to a case involving so-called oppression of minority bondholders. So are there limits to how far the governments can and should go? So what we're going to look at are a few different case studies. We'll basically focus on Ireland and Cyprus, and then we'll make reference to the ECB. But in Ireland, we'll talk about something called subordinated liability orders. We'll get into that. And then in Ireland, we'll talk about their asset management company, NAMA, National Asset Management Agency of Ireland. And in Cyprus, we'll talk about the bailing in of depositors. And then as to the ECB, we'll talk about the impact of preferred creditor status for ECB vis-a-vis private sector bondholders. So those are the main issues we'll consider. Now, in the wake of the, in response to the Irish crisis, Ireland took a time-tested measure, which was setting up a asset management company, NAMA. And as you can see, they acquired a huge portfolio of loans at a discounted price. They took over 74 billion euros of loans at a cost of $31.8 billion. And as a result of this, and these loans were largely property loans. And as you all know, and as we heard earlier today, there had been a property boom in Ireland, and then of course the bust. And this was the cleanup of that bust. And so NAMA became a huge player by virtue of taking over these property loans of the troubled banks. NAMA became a huge player in the Irish property market. And NAMA could realize value either by selling the properties, or they could further develop the properties if they thought that would bring additional value. And additionally, NAMA pursued certain legal actions vis-a-vis the property developers who were the borrowers on these loans. And so they pursued various asset recovery type actions. The loans were for property in Ireland, but there was property in the UK, there was property in the US. So this became a multinational, multi-jurisdictional situation. Now, it wasn't only the disreputable property developers that were concerned about NAMA. Some of the property developers that had decent reputations, more or less, they thought that if their loans were taken over by NAMA, that would basically contaminate their loans, even if they were non-impaired, contaminate the loans or tarnish their reputations, because basically everybody in the market is thinking about NAMA as a so-called bad bank. That's the terminology that's often used to describe these asset management companies. But some of the developers were concerned that they would be tainted by this bad bank stigma, and so they brought action challenging the whole NAMA framework, and they had expert testimony from a number of economists, including Professor Stiglitz from Columbia, saying, yes, just the mere fact that NAMA is acquiring loans related to property of certain developers, even if they didn't have lots of impaired loans, that could have a negative impact on their reputation. And ultimately, this did go to the Irish Supreme Court, and the Irish Supreme Court had a fairly complicated analysis of the situation. But in the final analysis, they said NAMA has a fair amount of discretion in deciding which bank assets. I think we saw the term used earlier this morning, eligible bank assets, deciding which bank assets they could acquire from the troubled banks. So that's fine for NAMA, but these types of developers like Mr. McKillen, they wanted to have a voice in this whole process so that they could voice objections along the lines of what the economists were saying, that this could have a negative impact on their portfolio of loans and their reputation. But the Irish court, the Supreme Court, said, okay, NAMA, you have broad discretion, but you're a public agency. Therefore, individuals, property developers like McKillen have a right to be heard and to express their concerns. So this is sort of a due process type issue, and it's interesting because we see these asset management companies set up around the world, and but they held NAMA's feet to the fire on this due process issue. Then there was another issue that came up in later years after Ireland was starting to rebound. NAMA was teaming up with some of the local property developers to develop, for example, housing. And the other developers who weren't included in that program by NAMA, they felt they were being disadvantaged because NAMA enjoyed the guarantee of the sovereign. So the other developers were saying the cost of capital for NAMA was too favorable vis-a-vis their cost of capital. And this went up to this was challenged by those other developers, and basically this is a European issue of state aid. They raised the issue of state aid. But however, the European Commission said this is not violative of the state aid rules. They said NAMA was developing properties that made commercial sense, and they said, moreover, that this fit within NAMA's broader mandate of recovering as much as they could for the taxpayer, maximizing value. So it was found not to be a violation of state aid under the EU rules. Then another major issue with Ireland were these so-called subordinated liabilities orders. And the essence of this was that as part of the emergency legislation, the finance minister was given authority to issue these, I'll call them SLOs, subordinated liability orders, which would subordinate the subordinated debt of the banks to, say, the preference shares of the banks. Now, preference shares, in a number of these cases, were held by the government. But the idea was to bail in the private sector to help. There was a huge need for recapitalization of the Irish banks. The Irish government didn't have the resources, so they looked to this bail-in technique. And but from a legal standpoint, it raises the interesting issue of subordinating higher-ranked securities to lower-ranked securities, which is something that is just not ordinary practice. And as I say, the sub-debt of the banks would become subordinated to the bank's preference shares. And of course, the sub-debt holders knew when they were buying the sub-debt that they were taking a certain amount of risk. But did they really contemplate that the ranking priorities would be reversed so that equity would come ahead of debt? So, of course, later on, the European authorities did institutionalize bail-ins as part of their toolkit for bank resolution. But these sub-debt holders didn't have the advance notice, okay? So that's something that creditors and investors think about ahead of time. What are the rules of the game? That's how they price their securities. But this was unexpected. Now, it gets worse, even worse, because many of you know that one of the tools in sovereign restructurings are these so-called exit consents. I won't go into all the details. We could do a whole separate program on that. But the idea is to get consent for the restructuring plan. The bondholders that are going along with the restructuring, before they tender their bonds, they approve a change to the terms of the old bonds, which they can do by some supermajority or even sometimes a bare majority vote, and to make the old bonds less attractive. In other words, to encourage those who might be thinking of holding out to go along with the restructuring. In this case, it became, this was sort of an egregious use of the exit consent mechanism. And Anglo-Irish Bank Corp basically had a provision where there would be redemption as to the old bonds. For every 1,000 euros in face value of bonds, a bondholder would receive 1 cent euro. And so you can see their economic value was being obliterated, okay? So there was a hedge fund, Sanagon Asset Management, They bought bonds with a face value of 17 million. Of course, they didn't pay 17 million for it, but they had that's neither here nor there really. They had bonds face value of 17 million, and for that, if they were to be redeemed, they'd get all of 170 euros. Okay, so this went up to the courts, and the important point here is that this didn't go to an Irish court, it didn't even go to one of the EU related courts. This was the bonds in question were governed by a UK trustee, so it went to the UK courts, okay? And the bonds were governed by UK law. But basically, the court found that this is unacceptable. It's what's called oppression of minority bondholders. For corporate people, we often talk about oppression of minority stockholders, but here it's oppression of minority bondholders. And they said basically it was the coercion of a minority by voting for a resolution which expropriates the minority's rights under their bonds for nominal consideration. So, as I say in the last bullet point here, one takeaway from this is, at least under a UK trust deed, you can't have an exit consent like this, which is an egregious abuse of power by the majority bondholders. Now we come to Cyprus, which we just heard about in the prior session, and here the issue is the bail-in of the depositors with over 100,000 euros in their bank accounts. And a number of depositors brought suit challenging the bail-in. And this went, for the North Americans here, we have to appreciate that in the EU there are lots of different tribunals and lots of different avenues for seeking relief. Here it went up to the European Union Court of Justice, and the court concluded that this was not an infringement of the right of property, principle of legitimate expectations, or the principle of equal treatment. And basically, the court was saying Cyprus had to take emergency measures, and those measures were not disproportionate and intolerant interference which infringes on the right to property. So it's sort of a balancing. They have to, they understand that Cyprus was taking emergency measures, but wasn't sort of proportionate to the detriment being suffered by the those who were being bailed in. Now, of course, Cyprus and Greece, the situations are very interconnected because, as was mentioned earlier, the Cypriot banks had big investments in the Greek bonds. When the Greek bonds were restructured, they took big losses. But this case I mentioned here, this has nothing to do with Cyprus. This was the original Greek case, and this again goes back to that issue of how do you bind minority creditors. As you all remember, in Greece they did something, some would say very innovative, creative, unprecedented perhaps, which was that the Greek law governed bonds, which were 90% of the bonds at issue in the Greek restructuring situation. They were governed by Greek law, 90% of the bonds, but they did not have collective action clauses, okay? So the Greek government took legislative action, an act of parliament, and they, to use the terminology, they retrofitted the outstanding bonds with collective action clauses by legislative action, okay? And in doing that, they were able to get the restructuring plan approved for those Greek law governed bonds. And they were able to get the huge debt relief that Greece needed, okay? However, there were certain bondholders who said, how can you do this? After the fact, have an act of parliament come back and modify our rights. Now, this went up to another European tribunal, the so-called European Court of Human Rights, because those litigating creditors said this was a violation of their rights under the European Convention on Human Rights. And essentially they were alleging that this interfered with their peaceful enjoyment of their property rights. And again, here the tribunal said, yes, this was an emergency measure that went pretty far, but it was essentially justified by the circumstances in Greece. They were facing a huge crisis and they needed a big restructuring with large haircuts. And so, as the court concluded, this is, again, the European Court of Human Rights, which is sort of a very specialized court. One doesn't normally think of that tribunal in the context of financial issues. But the court said the measures in question had not been disproportionate to their legitimate aim, and there had been no violation of the relevant provision of the European Convention on Human Rights. As I say in the second to last bullet point, they said the Greek government could have legitimately taken action to maintain maintain economic stability and restructure the debt in the general interests of the community. That was what they were saying was there's an overriding public aim at issue here, and that's why the Greeks acted as they did in retrofitting the bonds. And the last issue I want to address very briefly is, because we've been talking about legal expectation, legal certainty, is our friends at the ECB and their bond buying program. And if the bonds held by the ECB for Greece, for example, or Greece has a restructuring of its bonds, and private sector actors hold bonds too, if the ECB claims preferred creditor status, that basically effectively subordinates the private sector holders of the bonds to the ECB. They're holding the same bonds, but the ECB bonds are not subject to the restructuring. So that's a subordination, effective subordination of the private sector holders to the ECB. And as a result of that, of course, the private sector holders need to take a bigger haircut than would otherwise be the case if the ECB held bonds were part of that restructuring exercise. So to sum up, this is a very complicated area because if it gets to the tribunals for relevant tribunals for decision, they will have to weigh whether there's a bona fide emergency that the government is responding to, and whether the measures taken by the government legitimately advance a public aim, and then whether the benefits from taking those measures are not disproportionate to the detriment suffered by the parties affected. And as I was mentioning, one thing, again, in the European EU context is that there could be numerous fora for these disputes to be resolved. As I say, there was European Court of Human Rights. There was the EU, I think it was the EU itself. One of the disputes we mentioned ended up in the British courts. So for creditors and investors, they need to think about if they are prejudiced by government actions, what forum they'll pursue their rights in. But by the same token, the governments that are taking these measures, when they're contemplating these measures, they have to think, where will these challenges end up, and what are the likely rulings from these tribunals? And so we do have some learning from what happened in the wake of the Eurozone crisis in these countries. Thank you.
Sure, I can, I'll go ahead. Good morning. My name is Jonathan Corinne. I was a slightly last-minute addition to the panel. The CEO of Greylock was originally intending to be here. I'm taking his place. But I originally thought this event was going to be in New York, but I was really excited to hear that it was going to be here in Philadelphia on these particular topics, because as someone mentioned to me right before the panel, I went to school just a couple blocks from here over at UPenn and studied classical studies while I was there, so a lot of stuff about Greece. And when I called my parents to tell them that I was thinking about majoring in this subject, I wouldn't say the response was overwhelmingly enthusiastic. But anyway, you know, they were kind of supportive. But I decided that now that I'm back in West Philadelphia, I'd finally have the chance to get some mileage out of that degree and throw in a few mythological allusions and some. And so with a captive audience, I'm finally going to put to use some of what I learned over on Spruce Street. So with that kind of beginning is my presentation. Oh yeah, I'll do the. So Greylock, as was mentioned earlier, invests in sovereign debt restructurings, some corporate debt restructurings in those countries as well, primarily in emerging markets where many of the restructurings have taken place, but also over the years have been involved in a couple situations in the European Union. Greece is one, of course. We were on the committee for that. We've recently done work in Croatia. And the title of my presentation today is 3 extremely instructive comparisons. And the reason I call it that, just make sure I have is that I think, as we know in sovereign debt restructuring, is that the word extremely means that we learn a lot at the extremes, right? When we get into these types of situations, that's where we resolve a lot of the issues that we probably should have thought about or resolved before. And hopefully we learn from them, and I think the point of events like today is to do so. And also, so the first visual aid up there is Pygmalion, which is, of course, the creator that fell in love with his own creation. And most of these ideas that we start with are very good. We get into trouble with the good ideas because we take them too far. The different types of bank capital securities, the different types of hybrid capital securities, and in particular, what I'd like to focus on today, I know the 3 countries with the case studies, what I thought I would do is think about, in particular, their banking systems, how we approach thinking about their banking systems. A lot of the problems that we started out with, a lot of the crises that we're talking about, started in the banking system. And the response to those ended up being a very critical part of the overall debt restructuring. And when I think about what's out there in the world today, the opportunity set that we look at from the investor perspective, including the things I don't think I understand, or the things I would like to see cleared up by regulators, by the market, by different types of working groups. I could start here, not that I have all the answers, but I think there are questions that are worth discussing. I sometimes think about these types of situations before and what we can learn from them. So I thought I'd take 3 case studies and kind of pit them against counterexamples to try and see, and then think about where we can take that. So I've worked on a lot of different bank restructurings. The stuff that I'll discuss is a little bit anecdotal, but since the plural of anecdote is data, I think we can probably still end up in a good spot at the end. And then I just want to conclude with some broad things, policy recommendations that I think, or at least things that I think are worthy topics of discussions of working groups, or potential things down the road that we might be facing, and what can we learn from some of these European crises. So I will start with Ireland and Iceland. And I did not mean to pick on Moody's on this slide. I did not realize someone from Moody's would be sitting next to me on the panel. But I just wanted to, Moody's was the first thing on Google that came up. So they just have better search optimization or something like that. But, and then she can address what I said. And everyone heard the joke a long time ago that Ireland, the difference between Ireland and Iceland was 1 letter in 6 months. Everybody heard that back in the day. But I think, in particular, when I think about looking at Iceland and looking at Ireland, I think about the crises and the problems that we can kind of see coming. I think that Iceland in particular, at one point, for one moment of time, Iceland was rated AAA, or the Icelandic banks were rated AAA by all 3 agencies. At one point, in I think it was 2006, you could buy Iceland or Kaupthing CDS for about 60 basis points on a CDS contract. At that time, JP Morgan was trading for about 30, which meant that the credit markets felt that the probability of JP Morgan defaulting was only half as big as the probability of Kaupthing defaulting, which seems silly at the time, and it can seem silly, definitely in retrospect. So at the time, I put on, it was one of my, I'd say the first big trades that I did was put on a short in Kaupthing in the form of a CDS contract. You may be interested to know that I did not do it because I was particularly worried about the wholesale funding model. I was particularly worried about the fish market. These things can come about in strange ways. Iceland kind of got to where it was, as some people are aware, but some people are not, because they instituted a great model for fishing. Once they switched over to the away from an Olympic type of quota back to a more managed organization for managing fishing quotas, the economy did extremely well on the back of that. Energy did really well on the back of that, and then they decided to get into investment banking. But so as one of these odd sort of things I end up keeping track of, Peru now has been really getting its fishing act together, and you can kind of model the different fish markets and potentially follow it and see what they do with their banking system. But when I originally got into the trade, I was just convinced that there was going to be we just had the mad cow disease, we'd had Asian bird flu, and I was just convinced that there was a fish plague around the corner that would drive Iceland into bankruptcy. And it turned out not to be that. I was aware of the wholesale funding model. It turned out to be a freeze up in the wholesale funding market. And then you had Ireland have a very similar type of banking problem. And one economy decided to basically devalue, and one economy decided to take on a lot of the bank debt as sovereign debt. And which one you think was the winner, of course, depends on your point of view, both from an economic standpoint, from a social standpoint. I think if you just look at raw GDP, you could look at perhaps say maybe Ireland was a winner, even though I think it's a little bit tough to strip out how much of Irish output is a function of them being a tax haven. They have a big pharmaceutical presence. If you look at employment, you could say that Iceland is the winner. If you're a currency investor, once the capital controls ended, I think you are perfectly happy to invest in the renewed Icelandic currency. And Ireland continues to issue at low rates to this day. But in the meantime, you had different forms of bank investors and sovereign investors enduring a lot of pain. And I think about that in the context of, like I said, it's debatable which one you could call a success. It kind of depends on who you are and what price you bought. But I think about these two contexts, and then I look at Turkey. And I look at Turkey, and I know we had a blip in it so far, but I look at another banking system where there's not a lot of debt at the sovereign level, much like there wasn't in Iceland or Ireland, but a huge banking system that's heavily involved in foreign currencies, and in an economy that's hardly independent. And I think it's a really interesting question for if you think problems there are going to resume, which I think you can make a very good case. I mean, there was a lot of discussion about their current account deficit, but it took a massive, I mean, really, it took a currency crisis for them to even print 1 month of the current account surplus, and now the lira has strengthened again and they're right back into deficit. And I have yet to see an economic forecast or an economic model of the Turkish national accounts that doesn't rely pretty heavily on inflows, in particular portfolio inflows, in particular investors like me, continuing to put money into the country, which to me is kind of a national version of the wholesale funding that a lot of these banks were getting into, that got these banks into trouble. So if you believe in the kind of, clap and it'll happen type of macroeconomic analysis, then you could say that Turkey has issued bonds and will continue to issue bonds and they'll be just fine. But in the adverse case, where you look at something where you think about what could really happen in Turkey if they get back into trouble, and as a rough first estimate, I would say that you could say that between, if you kind of write off a lot of the construction loans in the banking system, if you double some of their other NPLs, I mean, you could end up looking at a 10% hit to GDP if the Turkish government decided to really bail out their banking system. And if they do, what would we want it to look like? What would the policymakers, what would investors want that to look like? Would they want that to look more like the Iceland model, because they do have a floating currency and they could just let it all go? They have some questionable appointments at the central bank. They may decide that there's enough political capital there to just take on the debt and to nationalize it. But in that case, you end up looking like more like an Ireland. So it's looking at these two case studies to kind of try to figure out how exactly we want to evaluate a situation like Turkey, which in my view is far from resolved. And just as a kind of coda there to the buying CDS story, I did buy Kapling CDS. I was at the time working at Bear Stearns. My counterparty was Lehman Brothers, so Kapling had the last laugh because they outlasted us both. Oh, the picture is Colin, who's like the Irish Hercules. He's killing the dog. So anyway, with the benefit of foresight, I think you can look at some of these things and you can say, you can sometimes see trouble coming, and then the question is how should policymakers respond to that, and how should investors respond to that? And at Greylock, we certainly have our views about how we would like to be positioned in Turkey and in the banks, and versus the lira, versus subordinated securities, and we're looking to these types of examples to kind of guide our way. The next one is Greece versus Cyprus, and Greylock, as I said, was on the restructuring committee for Greece. We ended up we've been active traders of the bank securities. This is this is a little bit more of something a puzzle I've still tried to figure out, and I've seen conflicting data, I've seen conflicting views, but it's still not clear to me why Cyprus was able to maintain a relatively stable level of deposits, and I've seen conflicting data on this, but when I look at the Bank of Cyprus, when I look at I mean, it's not as if, it doesn't look to me like in any case that deposits have fallen off a cliff, and once the trouble ended, people continue to deposit it. Whereas Greece had a huge deposit drop off in domestic residents, and to my observation, has never really recovered. And I think that part of it has to be explained by the fact that a lot of the deposits in Cyprus were non-domestic. They were coming from other source of countries. Greece was not necessarily a destination for deposits. As a result, we now have a situation in Greece where the banks are still trying to dig themselves out of this massive hole. And every time they get through one NPL problem, they run into another. And they have, they expected they might have been out of it in 2016 and then 2017, and they've continued to take on residential mortgages, and Alpha Bank has the Jupiter program that they've been working on. And there's, and I think a lot of it would be fixed if you had the type of situation where there was a return of confidence in terms of the banking system. And I haven't done a full analysis of where exactly some of these domestic deposits have gone, but I haven't seen them show up in BG or Alpha Bank. And you know, the context for this is what I think about when we're thinking about Argentina, looking at the banking system there. And you have a similar type of, and I don't have a good term for it, maybe someday we'll come up with one, where you have a system perennially bereft of confidence. I mean, I think part of the problem with Argentina, I know they had an epic drought, and I know that a lot of other things happened. There was a strong dollar and that type of thing. But a big problem, from my point of view, in Argentina last year is that you had this view that certain countries would need to issue in the market, would need funding, primarily Ukraine, primarily Ecuador, primarily Lebanon, and Argentina. But that's okay, because now we have this economic dream team in there, and the Kirchners are gone, and everything's going to be fine. And even though we're kind of running this slightly unconventional type of policy, it's okay because everybody loves this new team, and the business's investment's going to show up, and it didn't show up. And at a certain point, call it June or May or somewhere around the time frame, people started to realize that there was not a huge amount of private investment coming back into Argentina. So I don't know. Like I said, it seems like there should be a term of kind of like a confidence void or something like that. And so in evaluating things like if Argentina should go back into get into further trouble, or particularly the banking system, that's not a prediction, but if it will, how do these types of non-behavioral types of things impact the types of investing that we have to do? Because there's been a lot of money lost in European financial equities, partly based on these types of factors, which are not easily explained by a regulatory framework or even a type of legal recourse. And then my reference there is Solon, who was a Athenian mayor whose major legislative act was debt forgiveness, wiped out all the debt, and the economy did really well. So for everyone who thought Greece should just forgive the debt, there's a great precedent about 450 BC. And then I also want to just touch upon things that I'm thinking about in terms of the future, legal questions and regulatory questions that we have to address. And I know some of these get addressed. I don't know anyone that is intimately familiar with these. And when I talk about people that I know, are people that are pricing and trading these securities. Having different, and I know every country is going to have its own, have their own regulatory framework, and a central bank is going to do what a central bank is going to do. But having some Asian banks have bonds where the point of no viability or the point of non-payment is triggered by capital levels, and having other bonds that are triggered by profitability. In the case of Korea, I mean, you can have securities that stop paying because you lack a certain level of profitability, but in Japan or in Thailand, it's all based on capital. I find that to be something that is a little bit obscured sometimes in these bank index bonds. What is the timing and process of these evaluations? And I kind of tie that into the next point, which is the state-owned banks. there's a lot of state-owned banks that have capital bonds out there for which the point of non-payment is an injection of government funds. However, these are government-owned banks, so it is not clear at all to me who decides when, why, when does a dollar from the Brazilian government become a, when does it become a bail-in, when is it a rights offering, when is it a capital injection, when does it pay, who makes this decision? And I know, the typical answer is going to be, well, the central bank will make an evaluation, but when we're in the trenches, when we're in a crisis, or when you have an adversarial government that perhaps wants to stop paying for whatever reason, I think these types of things are worthy of clarification. I've never kind of gotten seen a framework where we could talk about in the point of non-viability in some of these new securities, what exactly is the process, who makes the decision, and can it be appealed, and that type of thing. And then there's other technical factors that I think come into play. When I was talking about Iceland and when I was talking about Moody's before, part of it I think when we were getting started was that Moody's issued a guidance on the hybrid capital. Part of it was the allowance of partial equity for the hybrid securities. There was a lot of confusion about what that meant, if the other rating agencies would go wrong. Moody's, of course, was a leader in their field and ahead of time and ahead of all the other agencies in their predictions and their work. But I think there was, there's also been a little bit of a miscommunication. Not that any one person miscommunicated, but when we're thinking about the demand and when we're thinking about the restrictions on these types of bonds, it is not just about one particular type of agencies. For example, when we're talking about the original hybrid capital securities, they got ratings credit for issuing bonds. Banks were allowed to do so. Eventually they got the Federal Reserve allowed it, the FDIC allowed it. But then at one point, the insurance commissioners decided, well, this may or may not be adequate for our purposes. For insurance companies to hold and to be awarded that rating, and maybe they should get partial credit for the rating. So, and at a certain point, if you're looking at the Wells Fargo, real estate mortgage investment conduits, if you're looking at Stanley Works had a hybrid bond, and certainly if you're looking at the European bank capital securities, there often seems to be a lot of movement, and some people would call that opportunity, but there seems to be a lot of movement based around a talking past one another, or having differing types of objectives for what these new securities are. And since the financial crisis, we have a library full of new different types of securities, all with different types of bells and whistles attached. So I think it's as an investor, I kind of welcome the volatility. As a concerned citizen, I think it's worth addressing some of these things ahead of time. Which kind of brings me, I think, to the last couple points I want to make is what are some of the things that I think we could address right now. And I mentioned one before, state-owned banks. I think there would be some, I think the market would benefit from some clarity there. The coordination of regulatory stances. I think a great one to look at and to learn from is the Sukuk market, which continues to grow by leaps and bounds. I think there's a huge range of questions there. A lot of the countries from the Middle East, especially the banks, have issued and financed themselves using the Sukuk market, selling to other types of financial institutions that are based not necessarily within the Middle East, but usually in Islamic countries. So you have Asian private banks, and particularly Indonesian private banks entering the Sukuk market. You have some private capital. You have a lot of the passive money funds going into this. However, there's been a lot of questions to me in particular, and it reminds me of a little bit the initial days of the hybrid capital market, where it's not totally clear to me that we have a kind of unified regulatory lineup around these types of securities. For example, it is not clear to me, and I've also never heard a clear answer from anyone at the IRS or anyone else, is how ultimately does the IRS view Sukuk? Do we view it as rental income? do we view it as interest? It sounds like it's interest. However, from what I understand, a lot of the earlier sukuk, and it's possible that this problem has been addressed and resolved in the past year or so, did not register as a corporation for IRS purposes. So for a long time, I tried to push these things through to get them involved in different US domiciled mutual funds, and I couldn't do it because I could not get a clear answer from the banks in London that had issued these types of securities, whether or not they had checked the box that made these things corporations for the purpose of recognizing the income and therefore tax deductibility of the associated cash flows. This may not sound, and it's really not yet a big deal, because you end up with a lot of the, even if you're a US person managing a fund, you have a lot of funds that are managed out of Luxembourg, or you have a UCITS fund, and so you kind of get around a lot of the US regulatory hurdles that way. But as these things become more, as the market continues to grow, you end up with either a divergence, whereas in the case at my prior employer, I was, we had a UCITS domiciled fund, we had a US domiciled fund, and we could get it approved for the Luxembourg domiciled fund, but not the US one, so we ended up with a different type of, different types of mandate holding different types of bonds. I think the sukuk themselves are not uniform in how they're treated. And that's even before you get into the different religious interpretations of how some of the law and some of the sanctity, really, in the literal sense, is recognized by the religious scholars that make these sort of pronouncements on the securities. So I think that's and so as I look forward, from lessons learned from the Eurozone crisis, in particular these three types of countries, the way we think about it is, as investors, we continue to look at different types of approaches at the sovereign level and how that will end up impacting price securities. We try to think about the different non-quantitative elements that go into these things. Behavioral finance has given us some kind of insight into that, but other types of factors may become more important as well. And then finally, I think there's a need for a few more working groups to hash through some of the issues that still remain unresolved. I continue to see, and everyone I think continues to see, if you're in asset management, the continued importance of ESG as a rising factor. I don't know if we've thought through some of the issues that bank capital securities may face as a result of that. I think there's growth in other types of markets that will have major impact because, again, they're an important source of funding for the Middle East, and these things are all related. So any problems in certain banks you may see pop up in Asia. If we've learned anything from the Eurozone banking problems, is that contagion continues to live on. But ultimately, these types of things will provide opportunities for investors like us, because the ambiguity kind of leads to price dislocations, and that, of course, is what we're hoping to identify. But in the meantime, I would love to hear everyone's thoughts, either during the Q&A or after the panel, about what types of solutions can be made to not just help kind of opportunistic investors, but also to make the bank capital securities market a continued viable place to invest. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
spot, so I'm going to stay over here. Okay, hi everyone, thanks for having me. I'm going to take a slightly different tack with my presentation. So I'll take a little bit more of a bigger picture perspective of the European debt crisis. And I'll give you kind of a credit perspective, and that topic is sort of close to my heart. I now manage the macro forecasting, macro research function at Moody's, but I spent the past 10 years as the credit officer covering the sovereign ratings portfolio. So most of the time during the sovereign debt crisis, I actually spent on the sovereign debt crisis. So I'll take you through some of the interesting questions that we faced from a credit perspective at the time, which will point to also some of the challenges and some of the lessons from the crisis. So I'll talk a little bit about the key challenges of the euro area debt crisis. I'll talk about, from a ratings perspective, some of the key questions we faced. And those, I probably think the tougher questions came towards the middle of the crisis. Talk about kind of market reactions and the recovery in Ireland, Portugal, and Cyprus. From a ratings perspective, the euro debt crisis, so the situation of the three countries that we focus on, essentially Ireland, Cyprus, and Portugal, looks quite different. And from a rating perspective, the rating parts look quite different. And the reason for that is for Cyprus, as well as for Greece, we considered the debt exchanges as a default. So by Moody's definition, that represented the default, which meant that you see the rating come all the way down to the bottom of the rating scale. So Cyprus and Greece had that pattern where the rating came down all the way down the rating scale, while for Ireland and for Portugal, it stabilized at just below investment grade. The ratings had been stable, just in case we're wondering, and Iceland is quite a different example, so I'm happy to tackle separately. The ratings have been stable for about a decade before that. And if anything, I think the bond implied ratings were above Moody's. So just for perspective there. So what I'll take is, I'll kind of share some of what the sovereign debt crisis looked in the middle of the crisis. And I'll take us through, I'll kind of give us a retrospective. If I transport us in the middle of 2012, so say sort of after some of the rating deterioration has happened, but before Draghi's comment about whatever it takes, this is what we were looking at. So we were looking at very significant deterioration in credit fundamentals for all the periphery countries. So on the economic side, we were looking at very challenging economic outlook. We had weak economic growth, high unemployment rates across countries, need for private sector deleveraging, challenged credit growth, given that the banking systems were not in a situation to support the economy, need for fiscal consolidation, and very weak consumer and business confidence across. We were looking at structural imbalances from the economic side, so the financial and real estate booms and busts were coupled with competitiveness losses and growing external imbalances, which meant that unwinding of the imbalances via what the economists call internal devaluation would likely take a long time to happen. There was no exchange rate mechanism which would help the adjustment, as it had, for example, in some of the Scandinavian crises early on. We were looking at very dramatic increases in government debt level post the global financial crisis. Ireland was probably the most dramatic example. Debt to GDP went from 20% to 120% over a couple of years. We were looking at very significant implementation risks to achieving the fiscal adjustment targets. We were looking at a situation where the debt levels in the nominal terms were not coming down, even if we had the prospects of that restructuring. So for example, Greece is kind of the headline example there. But if you actually look at nominal debt levels for Greece, despite the fact that private sector creditors' debt had just been written down to 8 cents on the dollar through the two debt exchanges, nominal debt levels were relatively stable, and part of it was due to the fact that the economic recession was so deep, and for the need for banking sector recapitalization, which came on top of the fiscal situation. And of course, the feedback loops between the banking sector and the sovereign balance sheets. Reflecting all that was also a very fragile market confidence and eroding non-domestic investor base. You saw the spike in the spreads, which would have exactly been the mirror image of what the ratings trajectory looked like. If you translate this into what that meant for the fiscal situation and what that meant for sovereign debt sustainability, it would have translated into starting point for adjustment being very large budget deficits, significant implementation risks to the fiscal adjustment targets, both from the risks coming to the economic outlook, but also because of the social and political acceptance of those austerity measures. High and rising again debt burden, limited room for fiscal maneuver, no cushion for contingencies on the fiscal side, and to sum it up, very low probability of a debt trajectory stabilizing in any under any reasonable assumptions. So that's what the middle of sort of 2012 looked like, and this is after the euro had come through 3 years had gone through 3 years of turmoil. Now, in addition to this, is what a typical crisis would look like. But in addition to the domestic country challenges, we actually had the euro area institutional framework. And I don't just mean the fact that you had, you have a common monetary policy with individual fiscal policies. If you were sitting in 2012 and you're looking at what were the scenarios for developments at the euro area level, we were really looking at very broad-based fan of possibilities. On one end, you had, so this is with respect to defaults and exits from the euro area, which is what we look at from a credit perspective. On one end of the area, you had defaults and exits, you had a complete euro area breakup. Then you had possibility of euro area preservations with potentially a few exits. Then you had euro area preservation with potentially a few defaults. And then on the more benign side, you had neutralization of debt in some form, or kind of euro area. One version of that is euro area debt backed by all member countries. Now, by 2014, we knew that we were sitting in a place where we had a couple of defaults and the euro area remained intact. But sitting in 2012, the market was giving non-negligible probabilities to complete euro breakup scenarios. So it was really a very wide range of institutional possibilities which brought risks and which were reflected in the widening of the spreads above and beyond of the domestic country, individual country challenges. So with that respect, the ECB's announcements in terms of whatever it takes made a big difference, and made a big difference in terms of investor confidence, and I'm sure that would have registered on the market side as well, in terms of, yes, there will be market for government bonds, and there will be market for government bonds at reasonable funding costs. So that if you look forward, there is actually some possibility of stabilizing the debt trajectories. This is for people that are not familiar with ratings, this is my 2-minute primer on sovereign ratings. But generally, the sovereign ratings look at a very narrow perspective, right? So we look at the probability, the capacity and willingness of a country to service its debt. So it's the probability and the capacity and the willingness to service the debt. We bucket the different factors that we looked into, kind of 4 main factors. So factor 1 is economic strength. And we look at things like growth dynamics, volatility of growth, competitiveness, the size and scale of the economy, diversification, also wealth levels, and so on. Under the factor 2, which we call institutional strength, we looked at the various strengths of government effectiveness, rule of law, generally the strength of the institutions, but again, with the very narrow perspective of delivering debt service. So it's not just governance in general, it's governance with respect to debt servicing capacity. It's including looking at policy credibility on the inflation side and on the fiscal side. We also look at the track record of default. Factor 3 is what we call fiscal strength, and that generally captures all of the factors that refer to the government balance sheet. So things like debt to GDP, debt burden, things like debt affordability, which we measure as interest payments to revenue, interest payments to GDP. General factors about debt trend, the composition of debt structure, maturities, and so on. We also look at contingent liabilities potentially coming from public sector enterprises, or on the other side, sovereign wealth fund assets. And then the factor 4 is what we call susceptibility to event risk. Looks at factors which could lead to a sudden rating transition. And we sort of group them into political risk, which could be the domestic political risk or geopolitical risks, government liquidity risks coming from market access, or shocks to market access, banking sector risks, so things that could lead to materialization of liabilities on the sovereign balance sheet from banking sector problems, and then the traditional balance of payments or external vulnerability analysis. They combine, so we combine economic strength and institutional strength with a 50-50 weight into a concept we call economic resiliency that combines in a nonlinear fashion with the fiscal strength, and then susceptibility to event risk acts as a drag, since it's just it essentially adds more risk, so it's a down push on the rating. And that produces a government bond rating range, which we use as a starting point for positioning the rating. The one place where we differ in terms of rating positioning with the methodology is slightly different. A lot of the areas that we look at are kind of similar across the rating agencies. But one place where we differ is how we position ratings in default. And a lot of people are not aware of that, but Moody's doesn't have a default or selective default rating. We position Moody's, and part of it comes from the fact that Moody's ratings refer to expected loss, while some of the other rating agencies look at probability of default. So Moody's positions the ratings at default at the bottom of the rating scale with respect to expected losses. So usually somewhere in the CAA1 to C range, the higher the expected losses, the lower down the rating scale. So that's sort of what guided the positioning of the ratings default, which was the Cyprus from the 3 case studies that we're looking at today. But the interesting questions came around, again, in the middle of the crisis, is where to position the countries for the countries that were entering bailout programs. Because, we were getting a lot of questions from the market in terms of, would you assign sort of supported rating and non-supported rating? And from a credit perspective, that wasn't especially helpful because non-supported rating for a country that has 20 to 25% of debt rollover needs for the year, has no market access, and there's no funding program on the side, non-supported rating essentially is default. So the question was where to stabilize the ratings for countries in support programs. And we essentially we maintained non-investment grade, so just below investment grade. We maintain non-investment grade ratings on countries in support programs. We ran a number, I'll share a couple of quantitative analysis that we ran. So we ran a number of quantitative exercises to try to see, can we quantify default risk and look at what happens to default risk for countries in support programs. So this is one example of the table, shows the sovereign default rates for countries with an IMF program and the countries without an IMF program. So the table it's 1983 to 2012 in terms of sample, and it's by horizon. So this is default within 1 year, default within 2 years, default within 5 years, and so on. And it looks at, so if you, for example, look at the 5-year default rate, countries with no IMF program have about 8% default rate over a 5-year horizon. For countries that have had an IMF program within the previous 2 years, the default rate is 16%. So we basically see that the default rate for countries in support programs is significantly high. It's about twice as high, and that difference remains all the way through the different horizons. And it's not, again, it's not surprising. The countries enter support programs when they're in distress, so when they have lost market access. So there are a lot of fundamental weaknesses that are there, and essentially that's what the calculation is capturing. But essentially show that support countries historically experience elevated default rates compared to non-program countries. And it was one of the reasons of where we positioned the support countries in non-investment grade. This is just on the side here. This is not a comment on the effectiveness of IMF programs. In fact, no. I'm serious. If IMF programs were not effective at avoiding default, that 16% would be more like 100%, right? So the fact that 85% of countries that enter an IMF program do not default, it essentially means that IMF programs are quite effective in terms of restoring creditworthiness. Okay. And then the second question, this is the last quirky data chart I'm going to show you, but the second question which kind of we grappled with through the crisis is what should we assume about market access? And a lot of the market sort of conversation around the time was returning to market access within a year or so. So we looked at, this is probably more relevant for the defaulting countries, but we looked at what happened to market access around default. So the chart that you see has market reaccess, so from the time of default to international market access, so the next issuance of bond on international markets. For the countries that have defaulted on sovereign bonds, and this is the last 20 years. And you see there's a big spread in the market reaccess. The average is about 5 years, which is quite long. And it's not it's 5.8 years after default, and it's 5.2 years after the default resolution. So it's not a function of the fact that it took a long time to resolve the default. The default was generally resolved within a year, which is relatively fast. It just takes time to rebuild, economic fundamentals and build policy credibility and rebuild kind of credibility and reputation to service debt. And it's not driven by, I was going to show you, it is not driven by the fact that a number of these countries, that's a very diverse defaulter sample, right, over the last 20 years. And about 43% of the defaulters never reaccess markets. Even if you take that out of the sample and you just limit it to countries that have reaccessed, the average is still 5 years after default. So it's still pretty long. So if you compare that with the countries that we're looking today, Cyprus was actually quite quick, so it was less than a year in terms of restoring market access after the restructuring. Greece really depends on how we measure it. If you count the January 2019 issues as the full market access, then we're looking at about 7 years, which is quite long. There were a couple of private placements in the prior years. So there was some partial access before that. Again, not comparable directly to the situations of Ireland and Portugal, because generally for countries that have only seen loss of market access but no default, the loss of market access period would be much shorter. So the 3 years that Portugal and Ireland were out of the markets, here would be a little bit shorter than the average, but I think if you compare with just stress situations, it's probably on the wrong side. And then I'll spend a couple of minutes on the recovery. So the recovery looks quite different, again, across the countries, and I left Greece here on the charts as well. So this slide shows the bars are the debt to GDP ratio. The blue line is the growth rate, GDP growth rate, and then the red line is the primary balance. And what you see is improved economic, and this has projections up to 2021. So the last 3 years essentially are projections. We're looking at improved economic and fiscal outlook in general across the countries, but still very elevated debt levels, especially still in the case of Greece. The crisis path looked very, very different. So you'd see much faster economic recovery in Ireland and much faster drop-off in the debt to GDP trajectory than in the other countries. The jump in the growth rate for Ireland is real, and the previous panel mentioned that. In 2015, there was a booking of transactions by multinationals, which showed up on Ireland's account. So you did actually have a 25% growth rate for that year. But it shows I think it makes the point that the growth rate is quite volatile there as well. The fiscal adjustment paths were so the economic recovery was quite well. You had a small recession in Ireland and a recovery. Portugal, you had a deep recession and recovery, and then Cyprus and Greece, you really had a very long recession for both those countries. You can see the dip in the blue line. And then the fiscal sort of followed that. You had a big drop-off in the primary balance for Ireland and for Portugal, and then a gradual adjustment, and you had a much longer period where the fiscal balances were negative for Cyprus and for Greece, in part reflecting the economic recessions. So credit standing is recovering for all of the three. I'll come back to that chart in a second. So we have a A2 current ratings file, we have a A2 with a stable outlook. Portugal will be Baa3 stable, return to investment grade, and Cyprus is at Ba2 stable. The improvement in the rating trajectories generally reflect the economic recovery, they reflect the improvement in the fiscal situation, and also the limiting of the linkages between the banking sector and the sovereign. We generally see reduced risk for the materialization of banking sector problems on the sovereign balance sheets for those countries. If you look at the blue dots, but the blue dots on the chart is the median rating, the rating for the median defaulter in a sense. So if you look at kind of recovery after the T is the time of default for Cyprus and for Greece, you can see the recovery in Cyprus is faster than what it had been for the median defaulter. For Greece is still quite a challenging situation. And I think I'll stop here. I think they file kind of, I'll take the lessons a bit different from the crisis. I think last slide. I think one thing that really kind of changed people's minds during the crisis is the importance of market access. I think a lot of advanced countries really took this for granted, and I think the crisis showed that that's not necessarily the case. And it was, all right, we got it. And I think for government funding models where you have something like 15 to 20% rollover needs every year, so 20% of debt needs to be rolled over every year, the countries are very reliant on uninterrupted market access. And I think the external environment made the big difference. The role of the ECB and in terms of having the support programs in place played a big role in terms of restoring confidence, but to the extent that the challenges were domestic, tackling the domestic situation and in terms of credit fundamentals is what really made a difference in terms of improving both the rates and market confidence. Defaults, as we saw, were a really quick cure for sovereign debt crisis. In addition to the default, adjusting economic policy and restoring economic imbalances and adjusting fiscal policy takes time to rebuild, so it's not a one-off quick solution. And I think I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Michael, do we have time for a question? I mean, I know we're running very, very late.
We should give a few minutes for questions and answers.
Does anybody have any questions you'd like to pose? Aitor, do you have any questions?
I do. I always have questions.
Please.
So this is for Elena. I think it's general for a lot of us that are really into this. So, I mean,
normally, when one thinks about this loss of market access, and one is thinking about the presence of the IMF or other official lenders, what these official lenders do is guarantee that the countries, they don't need to access the markets. They remove the countries from the market, so that therefore, I mean, why should you see any? I mean, I don't know the extent to which we can measure market reactions the way we do, right? Because if there are no funding needs, why should we be tapping the markets? Therefore, I mean, what is really the period of exclusion? I mean, is that period to include the period in which all the financing needs are covered by a different financier?
For the, shall I answer? I mean, I think for problem countries is a little bit, I think for some of the other cases, it's much more clear-cut because you have, a limited amount of international bonds, and it's quite clear-cut when the country can access markets again at reasonable rates. So you can look at the spreads, so you can look at the bond placement. It's quite easy to time. For the European debt crisis, and for it's less clear because you have there was a really nice ESM paper that came out a couple of years ago, which actually went through the 3 phases of market reaccess for the ESM countries, where you basically had a situation where you had no market access for a while. They had sort of partial access with smaller placement until you had what determines a full market access. So I think in the middle of it, I think it's quite difficult to judge. I think a few years, sort of looking at a historical perspective, it becomes much clearer to judge whether this was a restoration of market access.
Just have one quick question for Stephen. One point you mentioned on the sort of on the intercreditor equity.
Right.
And you had some good examples like with the ECB and but of course we have a similar challenge or the market may have a similar challenge with other official lenders who automatically subordinate private creditors, and I feel this is getting a little bit less clear than it has been, because now you see entities such as the World Bank, the MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency,
AIIB.
and others almost providing a monoline bond insurance. And if that insurance is invoked on a private sector contract, that almost automatically becomes official. So this is something that the market has to live with. But do you think there is some kind of a gap that we need to start thinking about plugging, and if so, how?
Well, that's a great question, and the preferred creditor status issue by itself, it's spreading. There are new institutions. I went to a lecture. I was in China in December, and the AIIB was speaking, a representative from the AIIB. So of course they now have they're claiming preferred creditor status. So I think it makes it more challenging then to do these restructurings down the line, because who's taking absorbing the pain? It's a narrower class, so the narrower it gets, the more of a loss those who are taking the hit have to take. So I think it's a big challenging issue, but I don't think anybody's focusing on IMF per se. I mean, that's been around for a while. People have gotten used to that, I guess, but it's a tough issue, I think.
Maybe we're going to start to see a little bit more interesting how that vision will come about, because with sovereign wealth funds and central banks taking a much more proactive reserve management sort of activities, they're starting to expand their investments into, let's say, credits that are not going to be as easy to deal with, and how that will come out will be interesting to see how they'll play. So, for example,
it's really this intersection of official institutions, public sector, where they're intersecting with private markets.
Right, and they're buying in primary markets, right? They're buying these assets in the primary market, and because they're central banks, can they claim preferred status when they're being held by the private sector? They were issued for the private sector in the first place. So it's going to be an interesting way see how things develop. Maybe this is a paper for MCM to think about. Sorry, I'm not to give you more work. Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.